Hi, let me introduce myself. My name is Eszter SOLT, and I am an assistant professor at Budapest University of Technology and Economics. My research field includes monetary and fiscal policy responses to crises. Now I am going to talk about the role of the fiscal and monetary policies during the COVID-19 crisis in countries with higher or lower income. And let me share the content with you. Let me share my PowerPoint presentation with you. Here we go. Let's start from the beginning. Just a second. Okay. Well, first about the choice of my topic. This is an actual topic because all the economies in the world were hit by COVID-19 in 2020 severely. Both advanced and developing economies have been thrown in recession. The damage of the COVID-19 pandemic to people and economy has been stronger than it was during the global financial crisis of 2008. As for the economic consequences, countries have been affected differently. The aim of my research is to introduce the policy tools countries implemented to give monetary stimulus to their economies, to analyze how policy responses to the pandemic differ in countries with different income levels, and to figure out what specific support will be necessary for economies of lower income. My research questions are as follows. To what extent does the macroeconomic state of an economy determine the use of the tools of fiscal and monetary policies? How did economies have to change their policies to tackle the coronavirus crisis? And does recession triggered by pandemic differ from other so-called normal recessions? I have studied a wide range of professional literature, and I have made analysis and comparison of qualitative and quantitative data. My data sources include the World Bank data, the IMF tracker of policy responses to COVID-19, Fiscal Monitor database, Statista, and Eurostat. The World Bank classifies the economies of the world in 4 income groups based on their GNI per capita. Countries with GNI per capita over 12,470 and 75 belong to the high income level category, while those with GNI per capita less than 1,026 US dollars belong to the lowest category. And now I will say some words about the impact of the pandemic. Contrary to 2009, in 2020-21, low-income and emerging economies were hit harder, and advanced countries suffered less by the economic crisis that the pandemic caused. Countries entered the crisis with historically low interest rates, 0.78% on average in most high-income countries. They had very high public debt levels at the same time. Central government gross marketable debt estimated at 72.6% of GDP for OECD countries overall at the end of 2019. There are credit rating differences between high and low income countries which determine their opportunities, how they can react to the shock with fiscal policies, because higher sovereign debt credit ratings of high-income countries facilitates them to react to the shock with fiscal policies more easily, while countries with lower credit ratings are limited in their use of the implementation of different policies. A country's access to credit markets or its credit rating may restrict its ability to introduce fiscal policies when short-term rates are extremely low, and it was the case when the pandemic broke out. Unconventional monetary policy tools include central bank guarantees, asset purchase programs, restrictions of dividend payments, relaxation of macroprudential rules. These policies are applied when the interest rates are so low that they can't be cut any further. Unconventional monetary policy tools may offset the effect of interest rates at their lower bound. What do monetary policy tools target? As for the conventional monetary policy, it targets short-term interest rates, while unconventional monetary policy is designed to affect term spreads or long-term risk-free rates, to influence liquidity and credit spreads or interest rates on different non-risk-free instruments, to ensure liquidity and restore asset valuations to support the monetary policy transmission mechanism. The advanced economies applied wide range of UMPTs, deploying asset purchases at the time of the global financial crisis resulted in a significant increase in the size of central bank balance sheets. And these countries launched large-scale asset purchase programs during this current pandemic as well. For example, just to show you the scale of asset purchase programs, the Fed purchases amounted to 4.5% of the US GDP. And the Fed purchases US Treasury debt and mortgage-backed securities, while the European Central Bank purchases public and private securities temporarily in the amount of 750 billion euros, which amounts to 6% of GDP of European Monetary Union economies. The central banks have got a new role, and the balance sheets have got a special emphasis because they have become the new tool of monetary policy instead of interest rates as a result of asset purchasing programs. But it doesn't mean giving up tightening by hiking short-term rates. It is the central bank's option whether to sell longer-term securities and affect the term structure of rates or to raise short-term rates. The goal of central banks in developing countries are to support financial sector development, which was further confirmed as a reform principle in the post-crisis era, and to ensure liquidity. Central banks' initiations to facilitate financial institutions' access to liquidity can be as follows: increasing the frequency of repo auctions, providing funds at longer maturities, creating new liquidity facilities, increasing the range of collateral accepted, expanding the set of eligible direct counterparties, and enhancing the availability of central bank liquidity indirectly. There are other policy tools besides unconventional monetary policy tools, effective fiscal policy tools, structural policy, microprudential or macroprudential policies. They are all necessary to introduce. In a broader policy framework, because the effectiveness of fiscal expansion is associated with the ability of central banks to commit to low for long policies. And the effectiveness of UMPTs is accompanied by appropriate policies and function in a broader policy framework. The role of national fiscal policies, among others, is increasing employment levels, maintaining the living standards of people, and maintaining economic development. But it's very important that fiscal policies have to be appropriate to the economy's specific circumstances. Aggregate fiscal packages include both budgetary and non-budgetary measures. Budgetary measures are spending on healthcare, transfers to firms and households, wage and unemployment subsidies, tax cut or deferrals. They have a direct negative impact on fiscal balances. On this map, you can see budgetary fiscal support to people and firms across countries. The source was the IMF database. And for instance, the green area shows economies. The budgetary fiscal spending falls between 5% and 7.5% of their GDP. So you can see how unevenly it is spread all over the world. Non-budgetary fiscal support means funding and credit guarantees, loans by government to firms, mostly to small and medium-sized enterprises, providing equity to strategic firms, government credit guarantees including fiscal backing for central bank programs aimed to maintain the flow of credit to the economy, and they have no immediate impact on the fiscal balance. In this chart, you can see discretionary fiscal response to COVID-19 in selected countries. It shows the emerging economies, while the next chart shows the response in the low-income and developing countries, while this chart shows the fiscal response in selected countries, meaning advanced economies. Fiscal policy responses in high-income economies accounts for 6.8% of their GDP on average, They have larger room for fiscal policies because they can raise and allocate resources swiftly, and as they have higher ratings, they have more access to external funding. At the same time, low-income economies have only fewer fiscal tools and policy options, and the amount of fiscal policies deployed amounted to 3.1% of GDP on average. So we can see that there is a huge difference between high-income economies and low-income economies as for the amount of fiscal policies deployed. Focus and determinants of fiscal policy responses also differ in these two categories. In high-income economies, the focus is to compensate those who are most adversely affected, but it is the same with emerging economies or economies with lower income as well. These high-income economies and both emerging economies, or they try to keep the pandemic under control. They aim to maintain people's living standard. They compensate households and businesses, and they implement different stimulus packages, and it's typical to mostly to high-income economies. For instance, in the US, the stimulus packages amounted to the 10% of the US GDP, while in the European Monetary Union economies, it accounts for 8% of their GDP. But it's not the same in emerging economies or economies with lower income. In these economies, the main goal is to maintain living standard of people and to give some assistance to small and medium-sized enterprises. And there is a special feature in these economies. It is that international investors are very sensitive to emerging economies' fiscal fundamentals, and they have little tolerance as for their debt levels, and their fiscal response is constrained by higher financing costs and reduced access to external funds, which also relates to economies with lower income. The determinants of fiscal packages are fiscal policy room, structural factors, income level, strength of the social safety nets, and automatic stabilizers in the economy. Let me say some words about the economic and social fragility of low-income developing countries. Global trade has been disrupted by falling demand, by falling consumption level, restrictions on the moving of people, and business shutdowns. In these countries, foreign financial flows have been withdrawn. In these economies, domestic capital and labor is not utilized sufficiently, and they are excessively exposed to global supply chains. So for this reason, assistance is needed to these economies. The G20 economies, the World Bank and the IMF and the developing banks of the low-income regions can play a very important role in providing aid and assistance to low-income developing countries with their efforts to respond to the current crisis. International economic cooperation has become essential to ensure that the global economy is restored and the long-term costs from the pandemic crisis are minimized. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye.